Christianity views God as perfect, as the perfect being, the perfect example of being. And it has been argued throughout classical theology that what is perfect cannot change, for if something is perfect, what can it change into? If perfection changes, it must necessarily change into imperfection, for it cannot get better, obviously, because it's perfect. However, in the Bible, there is a definite and an arguable difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament God. For example, in the Old Testament, a man gets stoned for picking up sticks on the Sabbath, while in the New Testament, Jesus justifies his disciples picking corn on the Sabbath. And in the Old Testament, any woman caught in adultery was stoned, but when when an adulteress is brought before Jesus, he lets her go. As well, in the Old Testament, Abraham, Job, David, Solomon, and many others were granted material wealth as a sign from God that he is pleased with them. However, in the New Testament, Jesus claims that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. There is an apparent difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, without even considering the wrathfulness and justness, as most Christians call it, of the Old Testament as opposed to the forgiving and loving and gracious God of the New Testament. However, most Christians will accept these contradictions that imply that God changes and that he changes his mind as a simple bringing of the new covenant in the New Testament. However, even if you accept this, there are still other very prevalent examples of God's imperfection. The most obvious and most apparent is in Genesis 6, when God decides to flood the world. God looks at the world and sees that people are evil and hateful and corrupt things. In Genesis 6:7, it claims that the Lord said, "I will wipe the human race I have created from the face of the earth. Yes, and I will destroy every living thing. All the people, the large animals, the small animals that scurry along the ground, and even the birds of the sky. I am sorry I ever made them." God is sorry that he made man. When we apologize for something, it implies that we were wrong or that we made a mistake. Otherwise, there is no reason to apologize. So, is God essentially claiming here that he made a mistake in creating man? Now also, in the very next verse, God in Genesis 6:7 says that he's going to destroy everything. All people, all animals, all birds, just not the fish, because fish are special. But he's going to destroy everything else except for the fish, which is interesting. But in the very next verse, it says that Noah found favor with God. So in 2 verses, God essentially goes from, "I am going to wipe out everything in the world," to, "Oh, hey Noah, you're a cool and righteous guy. Why don't you and your family just hop on a big boat and I'll save you from the flood?" The first issue here is that God made a mistake. He claims that, he is sorry that he ever made man. Therefore, it is apparent that God believes that the creation of man was a mistake. However, how can something that is perfect ever make a mistake? There are only 2 real explanations for this. Either God is wrong, and he didn't make a mistake in creating man, which means that God isn't perfect because he's wrong about making a mistake in creating man. Or, God made a mistake in creating man, and he isn't perfect because he made a mistake. The second issue here is that God changed his mind. There are several other instances of God changing his mind in the Bible, most notably with Exodus 32. Basically, Moses went up on the mountain to speak with God, and the Israelites got bored waiting for him to come back and made a golden calf to worship. In Exodus 10, God's anger burns against them, and he wishes to destroy them. However, Moses begs him not to destroy them, and in verse 14, the Lord, quote, changed his mind about the terrible disaster he had threatened to bring on his people. Now, God changing his mind, both in Genesis 6 and Exodus 32, illustrates that God can change. And we have already shown how something that is perfect cannot change. So, essentially, there are only two conclusions that can be drawn from this evidence. Either God is not perfect because God can change and God can make mistakes, or one of the testaments of the Bible, probably the Old Testament, because that is where all my examples of God changing his mind came from, is invalid and not divinely inspired, as Christians try to claim. However, if you're going to argue that the Old Testament is invalid, then many of the, quote, prophecy fulfillments, end quote, in the New Testament are invalid as well, which basically is no claim for the divinity of Jesus Christ and destroys the entire premise of Christianity. Therefore, God, in order for Christianity to exist, must necessarily be imperfect. However, does anyone really wish to worship an imperfect God?